Hello everyone, my name is Phawx. What we're taking a look at today is my Retro Dreamer G4A CM4 by My Retro Game Case. Thank you very much, Eddie Tay, for sending this out my way to review. Very briefly, why would you want to get this device? Well, there are essentially two reasons that this all boils down to. Number one, because it uses the Raspberry Pi Compute Module 4. It is technically upgradable to whatever new compute module from the Raspberry Pi Foundation whenever available. The Compute Module 4, or CM4 for short, is the new design of the compute module. So effectively, you could be confident that when the new CM5 comes out, whenever that may be, all you need to do is swap out the modules and you will have upgraded the power on your handheld. And number two, because you like the original GBA form factor. This device is on Kickstarter now and has about 2 weeks left to go. So you still have some time to decide. Is it worth the $150 asking price for the unassembled kit you have to assemble yourself? Yeah. The performance today will easily get you all the way up to most Dreamcast games. PS2 and GameCube aren't going to cut it here, but it can do PSP quite well despite the fact that I don't think the small screen benefits PSP games all that much. Without further ado, let's go into the full review. First thing we have to comment on is the build quality of the device itself. Because this device is piggybacking on the shell of an old device, largely the material and plastics are of a quality similar to what Nintendo themselves put out long ago. But because you'll be assembling this device yourself, the ultimate fit and finish might not be as aligned as well as the official Game Boy Advance. The G4A CM4 has multiple changes modified over the original GBA. There's a different screen, added and changed face buttons, as well as additional shoulder buttons. There is an added analog stick, and what looks like an extra screw added on the bottom left of the device. Let's first talk about the new screen. This has been upgraded to a new 3-inch 640x480 LCD that looks quite good head-on, but has poor viewing angles. Overall, text is clear, color reproduction is solid. With the use of fine bezel art, it can easily trick you into believing that what you're looking at isn't part of the screen. So overall, nice enough. Something that I've been cooking in the background has been looking at ways to record frame count and showing it to you guys. Total input latency, or end-to-end latency, is the result of calculating when an input was pressed and then counting how many frames go by before you see the screen update according to that action. In this video, I am recording at 240 FPS. The screen is a 60 Hz display. It takes 18 frames on a 240 FPS recording before the input is noticed. 240 FPS goes into 1000 4.17 times. This is how we'll determine 1000 milliseconds. So we multiply our frames, our frame is a count of 18, and we multiply that by 4.17, and the result is 75 milliseconds of total input latency, or end-to-end input latency. Remember that the screen is a 60 Hz panel. It updates the screen every 16.7 milliseconds. 16.7 milliseconds goes into 75 milliseconds 4.5 times. So between 4 to 5 frames is our total input latency, or end-to-end input latency. Effectively, the range is between 67 milliseconds and 84 milliseconds, which is what I and most others would classify as good. It's not great, but it's certainly not bad. One caveat to mention here is as custom firmware for this device expands and RetroArch has better support, using techniques like run-ahead can help lower this total input latency provided there is enough CPU power to run it. Now, let's talk about the D-pad and buttons. First off, even though the D-pad is from the GBA, the D-pad is overall worse than a real GBA. The D-pad on the G4A CM4 is incredibly mushy and overall not good. It's serviceable, but I'm glad there is the inclusion of the Vita analog stick as a potential backup if the D-pad is a non-starter for you. It is a bit odd because the original GBA D-pad is considerably better here. Next, let's talk about the face buttons. You know, when you take a look at these buttons through pictures, it almost looks like it's way too cramped. But the buttons are designed in such a fashion that they kind of corkscrew inward, so it's actually pretty comfortable. It's really kind of awesome that it feels as good as it does. And what I was reminded of when using it, it's almost as if like the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo logo, but in button form. They're actually solid face buttons. The original triggers on the device do feel slightly off, but still pretty similar to the original GBA. However, the added L2 and R2 buttons feel super awkward to press, and when you are building this device yourself, I would advise you to get this done as best as you can. In my completed unit, My L2 trigger was really mushy, but my R2 button felt tactile enough. So I'm going to discount this area a bit and say that the extra triggers are going to fall on you a bit to make sure that they feel well, as opposed to them not feeling well just because of that's how it is. I really do feel like this is just part of the whole DIY process. Since we're at this point in the video, it's as good a place as any to segue into battery and performance. As shown in this video, how you can charge devices actually via USB to the EXT port on the GBA. It's pretty cool that it's leveraging this port, but there is no apparent means of seeing it charging. You just kind of have to give it an hour or two. A very critical thing to note here is that the batteries used on the device are two 14500 3.7 volt batteries. You should not use standard AA on this device. But it is cool that they fit in here like normal. A quick word on battery life. The batteries are 800 mAh at 3.7 volt, and there are two of them. Effectively, we have 5.9 watt hours of battery life, which is actually quite small. However, my own battery life test playing PSP at length hit between 2 and 2.5 hours, so the total system power here is around 3 watts for most emulation tasks at most. Even though you'll be able to upgrade this device at some point in the future, where the performance of this device sits now is still pretty worthwhile. The Cortex A72s that we find on the CM4 are actually pretty decent. However, there is a real cap on the type of workloads you should expect from these CPUs. More or less, Dreamcast and PSP is where the end of the line is. Single-threaded CPUs are considerably under what is necessary for Dolphin to run well here. Effectively, we'd need single-threaded speeds to be almost 3 times faster just to properly cover GameCube in a meaningful way. I'm going to leave a few more game demos running in the background just so you can clearly see that everything does run exceedingly smooth. Again, up to Dreamcast and PSP. More custom firmwares are coming out, so there'll be a wider array of different systems that'll be emulated on this platform. But there is such a large performance gulf needed to actually emulate Dolphin. We literally need 3 times the single-threaded CPU speed to do GameCube emulation. We need 3 times single-threaded CPU speed to do Huygen emulation, super accurate Super Nintendo emulation. It will do SNES 9X just fine, but don't think that this is going to be doing Huygen at all, because it won't. It doesn't have enough power to be doing that. Outside of that, when we're talking about performance and battery, the other part that comes into this is thermals. Now, the device did get warm. It didn't get hot. The glass front did get hotter than the back. However, it didn't really get scalding hot at all. If you are susceptible to heat on devices, this may bother you for playing this device at length. However, if you look at the temperature of my hands, you can see that the temperature of my hands is exceedingly hot, warmer than most everything else on the device. So try to use that as a frame of reference. The device does get warm. It gets noticeably warm. So if that is something that would bother you, that's something to be mindful of, that playing at length on this device will actually increase how hot it does get. It doesn't get blisteringly hot, it just gets warm. So just thought I'd mention that. Alright, so let's recap on the pros and cons of the device. For pros, hardware is upgradable in the future with new compute modules. That's pretty awesome. Total input latency is actually pretty good. The GBA form factor is nice and pocketable. Worst case battery life is around 2.5 hours, which is okay. Lots of custom firmware support already available and good scene support. That's also great. For the negatives or the cons, the system doesn't have any current sleep support at all. The boot times are around 1 minute to get into the OS, and the D-pad really isn't very good. So that's the end of my review. If this is still something you're interested in, check the Kickstarter link in the description field below. The unit I'd recommend is the $150 model with Wi-Fi. Unless there are still early bird units available, definitely get those. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.